All right, so here we are continuing our lesson on Chapter 10, the Market Revolution. Um, so, yesterday we talked about the uh, implications of immigration and how that's starting to change America. This chapter is as much about economic influences and how America is changing in terms of markets and business as it is changing in terms of um, population and what this means for the future of America. These are two things that aren't mutually exclusive, and it's important that you understand that. Uh, to fuel the economic growth of America, you need workers. Immigrants provide the workers that are going to fuel that American growth. And what we're going to learn about today is another piece of that um, economic growth that's also really essential to this is transportation. So what we see in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s is a massive transportation boom in the United States. Again, helped by increased population, you need to move people around, and more people are desiring to move to new places, which means transportation has to be available for them to make these moves. So, one of the most important developments that leads to this change is the steam engine. The steam engine was invented in 1825 in England, okay? But the steam engine is something that's really, really, really important, okay? Because the steam engine makes things faster. The steam engine makes not only transportation faster, but in the long run, makes machines that help run factories uh, operate at faster rates as well. Uh, Basically, when you add an engine to any machine or any method of transportation, you get a lot more power. Power equals more speed. And machine power, because it doesn't get tired and it's not dependent on weather, is a lot greater than human or animal muscle power or wind power. So, what we see develop is all these new methods quickly created to improve upon transportation. Okay, the steam engine is one of the most important developments of the 19th century, really in human history. You have steamboats that improve river transportation, you have steamships that improve transportation across oceans or transatlantic voyages. Again, going back to the concept of uh, immigration. Immigration is more feasible now because that trip across the ocean is shorter. So more people start making that trip to escape Ireland or to escape Germany or wherever it is they want to go to seek a better life. Um, it also adds to the amount of cargo that can be carried. Ships can carry more cargo now. So this is all very, very important. What it does, what its long-term implication is the advent of the steam engine does something called shrinking time. And we're going to see a lot of inventions throughout the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century, all the way from the steam engine to the plane in 1903, that ultimately act to shrink time and distance. And what that means is basically it puts places closer together. It makes America seem less far away. What once seemed like an impossibly long journey can now be done in a much shorter time, therefore making it more feasible, making it more realistic, and making it more possible for people to go on long journeys, whether it's leaving Europe and coming to America as an immigrant, whether it's leaving Philadelphia and moving west to a St. Louis or a Chicago or something like that. Steam engine transportation makes all of this possible. So that's a business change, right? If you get in on steam engines, there's a lot of money to be made. And it also gives way to other transportation booms of the century. Most notably, we'll start with canals. So a canal basically is a man-made river. And we see several canals built around the United States that serve to, again, shrink time between places. Canals allow cargo to be canals allow cargo to be moved, faster, and to get to other cities and other places. It allows people to get from one place to another, from one city to another, to help populate other regions of the United States. The most important of these canals was the Erie Canal. And the person behind the Erie Canal was the governor of New York, a man by the name of DeWitt Clinton. And DeWitt Clinton campaigned really, really hard to get the Erie Canal built in New York. And basically what the Erie Canal ultimately connects is Lake Erie and the Hudson River. Okay, so the Erie Canal goes from Lake Erie to the Hudson River. And what that does is makes a connection between the Atlantic Ocean and the western part of, at least at that time, the western part of the United States, almost to the Mississippi River. Because now you can access the Great Lakes from the Atlantic Ocean through the canal. It's the Erie Canal right here. What's really important about it, this is what makes New York City what it is. Because New York City instantly becomes the main hub for goods produced coming into America, because you have access to everything else, right? You can come in through New York if you're bringing in imported goods from Europe. You can come into New York and take the Hudson River to the Erie Canal and take the Erie Canal to the lakes, and then you can drop things off and or people off or whatever in places like, Toronto, Canada for one, but also like Cleveland and Toledo and Detroit and Chicago and all these cities all over other parts of America. It connects America together, and it all funnels through New York City. And it's during this time, really in the 1820s and 30s, where we start to see New York City really start to emerge as America's biggest, greatest city. Railroads, of course, are the other important piece that comes out during this time, also with the steam engine, the tank. Now, railroads are probably the single most important invention of the entire 19th century. Okay, and railroads ultimately are a lot better than canals. Okay, unlike the canal, railroads work no matter what the weather is. Railroads really can go wherever you want them to go. As long as you can build it, people can take the railroad. And railroads ultimately are capable of an unlimited carrying capacity, right? You need to add more power, more coal or more stuff to feed the steam engine. But railroads can, if you add that more power to it, you just add more carts to the train, and you can move more stuff. You can move more goods across the country. You can move more people. Railroads are huge for the future of America. Where we build the railroads, ultimately, people put up things like telegraph lines. This is something else that shrinks time and distance between people. Communication and contact become easier. Railroad stops in certain places become bigger, more major American cities. Okay? Railroads are so important for the future of America, and they're going to be dominant throughout the 19th century, in particular in the North, in particular in the North or the Northeast and the Midwest. Now, I want to talk for a minute about Cornelius Vanderbilt. He's really the first great robber baron, super rich guy in American history. Vanderbilt is if you rated it, I think if you adjusted for inflation, he's like the fourth or fifth richest American in our country's history. And he made his money largely during this time. First off of steamboats, and then later off of railroads. He became the first major railroad baron, making millions of dollars off the railroads. Vanderbilt is an example of what I talked about yesterday. He was born here in America, but his father came over from Europe, and Vanderbilt, as a young man, started a ferry across, I want to say the Hudson River. I'm not sure what river, but he started a ferry company that took people, obviously across the river. Started making a lot of money doing that, and then expanded into transportation wholesale, talking about moving people on major steamships, and then ultimately in railroads. He becomes extremely powerful and extremely wealthy. This is an example of somebody who in Europe would not have been able to have the same success because of the because of the landed aristocracy that existed in Europe. But in America, a regular guy from an immigrant family can become whatever it is he wants to become. And he's one of the great success stories and one of the first great, really wealthy people in our country's history. And we're going to start to see a switch throughout the course of the 19th century where really a lot of our historical focus goes from political figures and leaders and military guys to business leaders and people that become extremely wealthy over the products and things they invest in. We also see during this time, because all of this stuff I'm talking about, all the steam engines, all the canals, all the railroads, they're pretty much all being built in the north. And that's going to be a really kind of a big deal in the long run because it's going to have major implications when we get to the Civil War in a few chapters, right? The federal government isn't mandating that railroads be built anywhere, okay? Internal improvements are largely being done by private enterprises and the states, okay? So we see most of these happen in the northern free states, and for good reason. Why do you think northern free states are building all the railroads? Because all the money in the South is tied up in cotton and slavery. And that means all the power that is with all the money in the South, and those powerful people don't want their lands that are meant for cotton fields to be cut through by railroads. So because of this, the South lags behind and doesn't start building a bunch of railroads while the North really, really does. And this is going to have major implications. This is going to have major implications in the long run, because while the South is doubling down on cash crops like cotton, in the North, we're growing many of our food supplies. We're building railroads. There's a prosperous trade going on between the Midwestern states and the Northeast, and that difference is going to be a big deal come Civil War time. Okay, so long term. So again, question number one, what are the long-term implications of this and how is it going to impact the Civil War? We just talked about that with all that building going on in the North. And the other question is, what does shrinking time mean? We talked about this. What does shrinking time and distance mean? And why is this going to be really, really important for the future of the country? So I'm going to show you a couple maps real quick. Here's a map of canals, and you'll notice most notably the Erie Canal goes here from the Hudson River to connect to Lake Erie, thereby connecting waterways through the Great Lakes, up and around here, to the Mississippi River, which is up this way, to other canals like the Miami and Erie Canal, which connects to the Ohio River. Same thing down here. So mainly because of this canal being our most important canal, it connects New York City, that part of America, to the rest of the country. So anything coming in from Europe or the South or wherever is going to go through New York City and make its way to wherever it has to go from there. I want you also to take a quick look at this map. There are railroads being built by the start of the Civil War. What do you notice about this map of the railroads? Where are all the railroads primarily being built? All of them, almost entirely, up north. The north is well connected, shrinking distance between places, right? We have a well-connected web of railroads that connect the Northeast and the Midwest, while the South has very few railroads. There's nothing really connecting it to the other part of the West, like Texas. There's nothing connecting it to Florida. There's very few access points in places for the railroads, meaning the South is very, very far behind in terms of their economic development in regards to factories, railroads, etc. Okay, this is an old school sewing machine, one of the first machines with interchangeable parts, and we talked about that a couple chapters ago, so that's another aspect of a big development during this time. All right, so this is all kinds of messed up. Sorry about this thing down here. All right, so another big thing we start to see during the during the 1830s and 40s is significant business expansion. Okay, we see business really start to grow, particularly in the Northeast, in the American Northeast. There's lots of money to be made off of railroads, railroad charters, and things like that. We start to see the expansion for the first time, not real expansion, but really the creation of the stock market. Now, the stock market worked very differently back then than how it works today. Really, the only people that had access to it were the people that were already very wealthy or invested in there. But it was a way for people to get financial growth and benefit, right? So that's a big deal. We see the factory system emerge for the first time. Because industry's growing in the North, we see the factory system really develop in the North as well. Again, fueled by the use of steam engines and fueled by the immigrants that are coming into the country looking for work. We're talking about the Irish who have to stop in the cities, and these factory jobs are what's available. Okay, so it results in some significant industrial growth. And what is that number one industry that's driving growth in the Northeast during this time? It's the textile industry. Clothes, shoes, all that stuff is what we're talking about here. Now, the factory is going to obviously change the way goods are produced. And, a lot of people think that, it was kind of like Henry Ford that created the assembly line and therefore factories. Well, mass production was something that existed, before Henry Ford created the assembly line. He just kind of streamlined the assembly line process. But factories have always been places where things are produced in great quantities and numbers. And the factory significantly changes the way we produce goods. What people always used to do is go to artisans to make things, right? If you need clothes made, you would go to a tailor, for instance. If you needed, your shoes made or fixed, you'd go to a cobbler. And these people would make unique clothes for you, or your family members would make these things for you. But now in a factory system, we see the mass production of clothing and shoes where they all kind of look the same and they can be sold in mass numbers. This puts a lot of artisans out of business. This puts these people like silversmiths and tailors, cobblers of shoes, and people like that suddenly out of a job because people can get these things cheaper from the factories, and they can serve them the same purpose. They weren't as concerned about making fashion statements or anything like that. So it makes a lot of sense to have things produced in, factory produced in mass numbers, and it puts a lot of these skilled laborers or artisans out of business. A lot of these artisans find themselves now having to work, kind of underemploy themselves, working in factories, doing the simple labor jobs of something that they're actually very skilled at. So that's kind of a downside of this business expansion. One notable outcome here is something called the Lowell system. So there was the Lowell factory in Lowell, Massachusetts, and this was a textile mill that employed young, unmarried women. So in this Lowell system, the workers there would typically be immigrant women that were young and unmarried, and they had very strict rules about work, strict rules about curfew. Most of them lived at or on like a dormitory, basically near the factory, and they had to adhere to these strict curfews. They were required to attend church. So a lot of the same New England ideologies, Puritan ideologies that had existed for a long time, well before. Okay, but the Lowell system gave us in 1833, 1834, kind of our first instance of any sort of organized labor strike. So the girls that worked there suffered through a wage cut and a rent increase at the same time. And the Lowell girls kind of united to oppose this, and this was our first American instance of a labor strike, all the way back in the 1830s. Okay, the women organized together, formed something called the Factory Girls Association, and to fight back against these rent increases and wage cuts. That's always one big thing that organized labor fights against that seems to happen, is when they seem to like, if times get tough financially, the owners will raise the rent and lower the wages, and this results in often in strikes. So these Lowell girls went on strike. It was a first attempt at organized labor. It didn't end up working particularly well, but it's important that we see this kind of happen, for the first time. And the long-term ramifications here, because we're talking about causation, is not the Supreme Court, but the Massachusetts State Court decision that was upheld by the Supreme Court in Commonwealth v. Hunt. And Commonwealth v. Hunt gave legal recourse for labor unions. It says labor unions are legal, not illegal. They're legal as long as they use legal means to achieve goals. In other words, labor unions are fine until they get violent, until they use any kind of illegal means and start fires or break things or something like that. It's the old argument that my right to swing my fists around ends where your face begins. So this is the kind of what we're talking about here. But it's the first ever significant court ruling in the United States dealing with labor. So Commonwealth v. Hunt is a pretty important court decision. In fact, important enough, we're going to call it super important AP point number 11, Commonwealth v. Hunt, because that's something that pops up from time to time on AP exams. So be aware of that. So first ever ruling really involving labor unions, and it said that labor unions are legal as long as the methods they use to achieve their goals are legal. Labor unions are legal as long as their methods are legal. Something else that fuels American industry during this time are significant advances in technology. We see machine tools become more prevalent. An example would be this right here. Using a sewing machine to produce clothing at a faster rate, to stitch and do things of that nature. So we're seeing that. Interchangeable parts, right? Interchangeable parts where you can use parts to bring together, to fix different products, whether it's guns or some small machines and things of that nature. So we're seeing a lot of advances in technology that is going to drive America forward a little bit during this time. They're not things necessarily that come from America initially, but it's their ideas that Americans are going to build on and are really going to help fuel the second industrial revolution later on in the century. So I think that's it for this time. I kind of switched this slide up a little bit. I don't know if there's anything else, so if there is, we'll talk about it. If not, I'll have the rest of the notes for you tomorrow. And apparently there is more. So, okay. So let's talk for a minute then about our early corporate system. So business in America is very different in the 1830s than what we're used to today. The early corporate system is much more restricted to people in large cities, Philadelphia, New York, etc. But they introduced to us the concept of something we're going to call limited liability. And this is what's going to fuel the stock market. The concept of limited liability basically is this. So I can start a business on my own, but I'm completely liable for it. Basically, my entire investment, if the business fails, I lose everything. However, if I get a bunch of people to buy into my product, if you've ever watched a show like Shark Tank, you see something like this. If I get a bunch of people to buy into my product, that limits my liability. The greater percentage of my business that I'm willing to sell off to other investors works twofold. It provides more capital for my business and allows it to potentially grow, and it also limits my liability in case the business fails. I only lose my investment. And that is the genius of the concept of limited liability. You can only lose as much as you invest. That's the genius of the stock market. Stock market and limited liability kind of work the same way, right? If I invest $1,000 in a stock and the stock value plummets to zero, or the stock value goes up to 10,000, and I keep it in there and it goes back to zero or whatever, I still only lose the amount that I invested. So you're taking a chance for sure, but you're also limiting the amount ultimately that you can lose. And this is genius in the concept of limited liability. A lot of businessmen and people take advantage of this concept beginning in the 1830s and 40s by investing in the stock market and investing in different ideas to help American industry grow in these early years. So again, I think that's it. So we're going to cut things off now because we already went a little longer than I thought we would. So that's it, and I will see you tomorrow.